territory. Okay, how are we doing out there?
Your mic was muted.
Oh, okay. Let's start all over again.
Yes.
Everyone, it's great to have you here. Tonight, we are doing this special episode of the 8th Sphere X Series 169. This is 8th Sphere AI Warning, a Kona Blue UFO. Of course, tonight, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, so I guess, was your mic muted or just mine?
I think it was yours.
That's very interesting indeed. It seems like we're okay now.
Mm-hmm.
What's fascinating is, of course, is there life on Mars is the question.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I bring that up is because in association with our theme and our concept tonight around the 8th sphere, which I think is one of the most important pieces of mystery school information in the literature passed down to us, and maybe it came out a little too early, and so there was very special care taken to kind of put it in its proper perspective. At a certain point, Anthroposophy's Rudolf Steiner, the leader of spiritual science, said that it was the highest secret that the mystery schools held. So you can see that tumbling out the way that it did under unusual circumstances may have set up a number of chain reactions in that entire esoteric secret society world. But I ran across a series of these art installations that were sponsored by NASA, and they were supposed to be about life on Mars. But to me, they looked like life in the 8th sphere.
Mm.
So that was kind of a fascinating part about all this. And, you know, there's a kind of a zombie reality to it. And this gets us very much into this concept because the 8th sphere, when it's brought in, as I think the schools intended for this to be brought forward, it is really something that we're looking at in the 21st century as a virtual reality piece. It's when we project our consciousness into something that isn't physically there. And that builds and helps to shape the 8th sphere. And the 8th sphere comes into a kind of cosmology of the mystery schools. And part of that cosmology is coming in through Steiner's work, Rudolf Steiner's work, and it's giving us this hint that these types of imaginations build the 8th sphere and that it becomes an artificial step then in the spiritual evolution of humanity. Quite fascinating indeed, but how this overlaps into one space and two artificial intelligence, AI, this is the real major question tonight, and it overlaps directly with the UFO file. Now, this is interesting because the Kona Blue UFO files have come out, 56 pages, and we've kept a real close eye on Kona Blue. We told you about Kona Blue before the government did. So
a year before.
A year before.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I have a series of these put together here. And this is, again, in the larger context of the Blue UFO file, which is something that they've used and goes all the way back to the schools around the Masonic lodges and all the Blue Lodge information. That's where the original secrecy codes used for the UFO file are held. This episode, which deals with the entire Blue UFO file, Kona Blue, May 26, 2023. So X Series 150, there's no disputing it. It's out there. It's something that we did and put out there, followed up with 4 more episodes on Blue throughout 2023 and what that UFO file program, and stretches all the way back through the setup of the UFO file around the time that the CIA was created, and then gets us into the Kennedy period and Blue Gemini and the whole Blue Enigma piece. We did Blue Enigma for the Kennedy 60th anniversary. All the Blue information is in there about the UFO file. Kona Blue is directly under that umbrella. And of course, finally, we did the Kona Blue program when they actually announced this and it came out, and we try to kind of give you the information that we had in relation to this. And then the code, then the next piece was the code for Kona. So we put that on the record as well. The code for Kona was quite fascinating because it related to these crash retrievals, which taught them a great deal, or something quite remarkable happened in association with this APOTHEUM effect that we've described in relation to the UFO file. So the K then stood for Kingman, Arizona, which was a major crash retrieval case that occurred in 1950. The next one was Ossining, New York, where eventually you'd have a lot of unusual activity around the 9 and Andrei Puharich stationing there because they had a large-scale wave of sightings and retrievals there. Next up, we have the Nellis Air Force Base incident and the retrieval there of something that crashed, and then the craft that went to look for it. And finally, was the Aztec case, which took place in 1948, and is one of the most well-documented and heavily, heavily discredited by the intelligence agencies because it was loaded with information far beyond Roswell or anything like that. So that is the Kona code. And it's interesting because in the documents themselves, they try to lay out this Hawaiian thing. It has nothing to do with anything. Uh, there is, of course, Kona, Hawaii, but they that wouldn't relate at all to anything in this. As a matter of fact, it's kind of the cover story for it. And I will say the documents themselves in Kona are intentionally left vague, and they were meant to be discovered. So in this sense, it's not some great secret being released by the government. Yet there are things in there that I think are valuable. And the blue aspect and how it is revealed, and the fact that we put it on the record for you about 10 months in advance, is crucial because it goes to the heart of one of the things I want to mention about all this, which is when you get into the UFO file, there's a great deal that can be done without the government, without CIA people telling you. And this is one of the big disgraces that went on this week, which was the Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan interview. And, they were talking about a lot of things and freewheeling, which is always a good thing. But, all the people that they cited as their sources, Gary Nolan, decade in the CIA, all programs for the CIA, good friend of Anthony Fauci, high-fiving Fauci, saying, what an established, incredible, distinguished career. So, do you want Fauci in charge of your UFO disclosure? I don't think so. So that's Nolan. And then they brought in Chris Mellon, who, was controlling the whistleblowers. And that goes into the documents that were released. Now, a big major FOIA document dump through the Black Vault and John Greenwald, putting those documents out just in the last 24 hours. This is remarkable because it shows a great deal of that control by Mellon. And it also shows places where Grush went on the record and was not being honest about his interactions with this government group named AARO, which is the UFO Defense Office. And it shows that the CIA wanted to keep the upper hand on what they were doing there, and Mellon running interference all the way for his boy there, David Grush, and just puppeteering that situation, as we've put on the record. Now, we have our own history with that, which I've exposed ATIP and TTSA and all those things over the course of the past 5 years or so. And most recently, I had the conversation with David Grush back in December. One of the things that he communicated to me, which is also false, was that this whole AARO thing, that they wouldn't meet with him and all this stuff. It all turned out to be false, as his comments on the public record turned out to be inaccurate as well. Why he's playing
That's very
those?
polite.
Yeah,
We just call it a lie.
right. The way I would look at it is, when someone gets to that stage where they're being handled, as Grush is handled on that level with Mellon and Elizondo and all those people, in particular Mellon. And one of the problems, of course, we had, and we did that whole puppeteer episode at the beginning of the year, and we had a huge dust-up online with Mellon himself, who tried to do all these discrediting things, and really, I mean, it was kind of embarrassing, the throwdown there, because his best defense was to say, there's no way that this pseudo researcher can come after me and blah blah blah. And I sit here in my billionaire ivory tower and direct these people. Well, it's interesting because he gave an interview to Gizmodo about a month later, and maybe there was like a weird need to confess. But he goes on record saying that the whole New York Times article from 2017 dealing with the UFO piece, and with this whole idea of Elizondo was a whistleblower, all that phony CIA stuff that they rolled out. He said, "Oh yeah, there was no investigative journalism there. I gave them the story, and they repeated it verbatim." So he wrote a bunch of CIA dialogue in the background. You have to remember with Mellon, not only is he from the Mellon banking family, but that he's been in the DoD in those intel circles, and he's been called the mayor of Area 51 because he was the guy who used to go to these facilities where they're working on the UFO file. And he was the one giving them kind of the thumbs up, like, keep up that secrecy, boys. And so we have to remember who these people are. So when we get into situations where people like Rogan and Tucker are talking and they're citing them, as a matter of fact, at a certain point, when they're talking about the Kona Blue stuff, Tucker starts reading his phone and a text from Elizondo saying, these documents are real, and, I was right in the heart of it and all this stuff. And he's like, my source in the DoD, going to Elizondo. I mean, if that's who you're using as your source, these are counterintelligence people. They've worked for decades with the CIA. Those people are never going to give you the truth. And there you are spilling it out to millions of people. Go for the real sources. So one of the great things that you could say that has been demonstrated by us pulling out the whole blue UFO file last year before the government had it out is to show that, look, you don't need to go to the CIA to get this kind of information. The real research, going deep on the whole thing, you can get very, very deep. And those people are always going to throw you off because counterintelligence people or CIA people literally have zero incentive to give the truth to the public. There's no incentive for them at all. And if anything, what they want to do is spill a lot of disinformation online to get people fighting over things that don't matter, like the Kona Blue documents, for example. Now, I think, however, the Kona Blue thing is valuable in this sense, not because I think that there's some, great breakthrough in those documents. And remember, what they're trying to prove in the documents is that Homeland Security picked up the UFO file and didn't do anything that it was instructed to do. So in those documents, it says this was all a proposal to Homeland Security, and Kona Blue was going to do crash retrieval stuff. It was going to deal with remote viewing. And they get into like all of these consciousness areas and all these other things, which I think is left there intentionally. But at the end of it, you have the big kibosh signed off on by the deputy director. And this becomes then, again, pumping up that air balloon saying, here is this document about this Kona Blue program. It was going to deal with UFO crash retrievals. But guess what? At the last minute, Homeland Security pulled the plug on it. Now, the mere fact that Homeland Security would be involved in the UFO file is a huge, major, major red flag, and brings in the whole piece about Northcom and NORAD, which gets us into the continuity of government program. So the Northcom commander is the COG commander, is the NORAD commander. It's all the same position. And they just recently switched it out. But all of these guys have that UFO connection, interestingly enough. The last one was associated directly with the 509th, which was the original group that sought out the Roswell wreckage. We've got the leader of the Space Force, who has the huge connection with Malmstrom Air Force Base. They always have to have this like a signature because it shows, look, I'm on that level of X secrecy. You can trust me. And so they put them specifically in these positions. But I think that the addition of Homeland Security, just like last year when they held the hearings, Homeland Security sponsored the whole thing. And they had Homeland Security people up there. These are not good developments for the UFO file, because as we've seen with people like Mayorkas, there's an entire culture inside of DHS which is corrupt. Not to mention this happens in the intelligence agencies anyway. But that sprawling bureaucracy of Homeland Security, 250,000 employees, that's 250,000 people for an organization that didn't exist 20 years ago, and all brought on with the Patriot Act and the 9/11 attacks and that whole thing that allowed for this highly, highly unconstitutional group. So the Kona Blue documents at least show us that relationship of Homeland Security with the UFO file, which I think is valuable. And we're going to get into it tonight. We have the documents. We're going to do a major crisscross between the Eighth Sphere piece and the secrecy around the UFO file. And blue is right in the heart of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 169, and it's the Eighth Sphere AI warning. Kona Blue UFO. Yes, those two things somehow have this overlap. And the introduction of the Eighth Sphere conceptually is maybe one of the most important things that we got from these esoteric mystery schools, putting it on the record for us to deal with in the 21st century through the figure of Rudolf Steiner. And yet you're going to find it showing up previous to Steiner by a good 20 years in literature. And then if you go further back and we go into the early versions of the Tarochi, the early tarot cards, we're going to find the Eighth Sphere sitting right in the middle of that. Its significance and some of the key passages that Steiner had to say about it. And as I've said, when we get around Steiner's work, one of the things that I feel, having digested a good deal of his work over the years and seeing just how far ahead of its time it was, really, he spent about 4 decades trying to warn us about this force, Ahrimanic force coming through technology and the great threat that this Ahrimanic force held for humanity by creating an artificial step in spiritual evolution. This becomes the crux of what we're talking about. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature?
Good. Frankie Ferrari said DJ dropped Kona Blue on us before DHS did. And Gabriel Hutchison says he has to be gloating over the Kona report. Terry Doherty said, I don't think he gloats, just satisfied.
Well, it's important in this sense. It's funny because I don't like to, it's not so much about that I feel that I'm right. What I think is important is when we put something on the record, and we've done this a number of times with the X series, and then it gets proven out through the public process. Now, a lot of the people who will push these things and all the rest don't want anything to do with the X series or Dark Journalist or anything along that line. A lot of them are marketeers or intelligence people, and they see the work that we do as anathema to their goals. But what happens is, when we put this whole blue piece on the record last year, when the government bubbles over with it in March of 2024, and we've already been talking about it for 10 months, there's a weird thing there. Those people have to run off and talk about it. But the people who follow this show or in the Ideas Room, very well that we were doing the Blue Enigma specials and that we brought this in. So the whole crux of the point is, what is the blue aspect of the UFO file? What is that umbrella that Kona Blue sits in? And this becomes the crux of it. But it should be hopefully a kind of a reassuring thing about the research that we do on this program. That maybe I think is where the value is for when it becomes the kind of public domain. But you see a lot of that, and it's not a bragging thing. You see a lot of that with the X series because we tend to be ahead of a lot of the things that come out. And the reason for that is we're working on, the track that I'm working on goes directly into the heart of the UFO file and the mystery school activity. When you crisscross those, you get all kinds of answers that no CIA person or counter intel person is ever going to give you. And one of the reasons I think that the UFO whistleblower Grush crossed over and came to me with all this information last December was because they were curious about how I had Kona Blue before it was public. And that, they were like, let's send him out and have him talk. And, DJ will be so curious about this part that we'll find out where he got Kona Blue from. And I don't think that they did from our conversations. But that whole thing exploded into the Mellon situation. What's dangerous, I will say this, and it should be something that can go on the record in relation to people like, our friend Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. The sources that they use are people like Mellon, who's in that billionaire DOD, hide things at Area 51, create a UFO threat to create an emergency powers situation, continuity of government program. That whole thing, these are people who are wrapped up in that for one reason or another. Some of them have been told in the background this whole UAP thing is like the gold rush of the 21st century because it's that breaking back in with the technology. And a lot of these people, as I've put on the record, senators, Congress people, they never had anything to do with the UFO file at all. And they don't know a great deal about it, but they're hearing in the background, this thing is going to be important. Put yourself out there, promote it, pretend that you're like a public whistleblower and get, this whole thing going. So you see all these people like Ruben Gallego, the Senate candidate in Arizona, and he's like, we have to get that UFO UAP truth out there. And what does Galileo have to do with the UFO file at all, or any of these people, really? So they're being told, and if we can get a handle and be ahead of them on this UFO threat piece, we're going to have a tremendous advantage going into the fireworks that await us here in this election of 2024. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 169, the Eighth Sphere AI warning, Kona Blue UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. Miss Olivia is putting those together right now, and you can ask them throughout. I want to also say that, especially if you're new here, you should go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch through the kind of remarkable censorship. And this is probably one of the big key things, is we're one of the most censored channels anywhere because of the importance of the information that we put out. Getting on that newsletter list gets you around all that. It's a free newsletter, and it lets you know the incredible, and I mean remarkable, shows that we have coming up for you. Interviews, very important X series episodes, specials, documentaries like the huge Hot Zone documentary we have coming up for you on May 3rd at 8 p.m. It's a 2-hour presentation. We've been working on it, having some really fantastic results getting this to you. This will change everything that we know about Atlantis, and everyone's going to be switched on after this. And it has all of the key important Hot Zone information, and I've added a great deal of new facts. And that's going to be 8 p.m. Eastern on May 3rd, which is 2 weeks from tonight. Put it on your calendar right now, because that one's going to be a keeper. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature there?
Good. Jessica Rodriguez says, I wonder what connections the Eighth Sphere has to Kona Blue. This should be a very interesting show tonight. And Nature Nate 108 says, we still don't know if there's an Eighth Sphere on other solar systems, do we? Do the aliens who fly these ships, it's a continuation, I'm waiting for the next part, do they? Do they have an Eighth Sphere on other solar systems? What does Steiner say?
Well, we don't know. We know very, very, very little about the Eighth Sphere in this system. You don't need to jump anywhere to try to figure out, does another system have one? Because we know very little. There are occult fragments of unknown teachings around this, and probably most of it slipped out by accident. So, if you can handle things around the Eighth Sphere and what's on the record, the little fragments that there are, then, maybe we can get to a place to ask other questions like that. But the Eighth Sphere is something, that we're talking about in relation to this system, and in relation to our life here in this time on Earth. And it's very important, because the building of the Eighth Sphere represents then, and this is where we get into reincarnation. We did a special episode last week on reincarnation, and reincarnation's very important in understanding this, or at least understanding that there is some kind of developmental phase that happens beyond just our earthly lifetime. Now, in the traditional mystery track, here's the way it works, and this would run, say, through Theosophy, Anthroposophy, the Casey work, and in some others. Basically, what you have is there's a cycle of development that takes place, and all of the different planets in the system represent a different kind of classroom or a different level. which is why astrology becomes so important, because when you're born, those planets are in a position to represent the school, basically, that you just left, the level that you're coming in from. And so when you get into these different planetary lifetimes, planetary sojourns, you take on a different body for each. And, in the Casey readings, they talk about how the Venus body is the closest to the physical body that we have here, but it's not going to be physically observable with our telescopes and things like that. It takes place on a different level. And what happens is you go through the various levels in this system, developing a number of different qualities to the point where you've overcome all of the things in this system. And then the doorway out is somewhere in that Pleiades Arcturus aspect. This comes up again and again in the Casey work. Now, what's fascinating is this is a spiritual evolutionary track. And yes, it deals with a kind of mystery cosmology. But what's special about Steiner's work is he talks about this interruption. And so the interruption that takes place around the eighth sphere works like this, that the Ahrimanic forces create a false evolutionary step. And the false step is created through enticing our clairvoyant imagination. So basically, in a number of things in life, we get carried away with different types of things. People get carried away with different movements, and they get kind of bedazzled by things and taken out of their center and all the rest. And we all know what it's like to be hyper sold something, or if a movie is hyper sold, whatever it happens to be, that gives us some kind of indication of how these things work. But when they get to a point of entrainment around virtual reality and placing you, as we hear all this talk about putting a chip in your brain and placing you in a different reality, and how your consciousness can go to Mars while your body stays here. Isn't that great? There have been hints of things, and some people have tried to, in things like The Matrix, for example, there are hints that they're grabbing off this esoteric tradition, just not with a lot of background. But nonetheless, it comes across. It comes across in Star Trek. It comes across in Star Wars, in a number of imaginative things that have been placed in public. There's some knowledge, there's some hint of knowledge about this. And the Terminator movies, I think, are classic examples of this, because in the Terminator movies, you have Sarah Connor encountering Skynet, which is seeking her out to retroactively snuff her out so she won't give birth to the leader of this rebellion in the future. It's actually a very advanced concept. And what happens if you follow the storyline, there's all kinds of things in there. There's time travel, there's APOTHEUM, there's advanced technology, and there is AI takeover. And ultimately, there's Skynet. One of the fascinating things that takes place is that they move through time back from 2029 into 1984 in the original, and I'll just stick with the original. And what's interesting is there's always, when they're traveling through time, there are these kind of electronic lightning bolts. There's a sense of electricity going on. And at the end, when Sarah is overcoming this transhumanist Terminator that's going after her, again, we see more of this electricity APOTHEUM effect taking place. And the emphasis also on the hand in those movies shows a deep level of esoteric knowledge, because this isn't just, oh, look, a scary claw, but it is actually the mineralization versus the human being, which is what gives the movie such a powerful impact. The other thing is the mere fact that you have this Terminator machine hunting this woman who is giving birth. This is something that is very eighth sphere oriented, because what they're trying to do, just like you see them with the, they're trying to interrupt our knowledge about genders. They're trying to control with CRISPR activity the way that births take place. There's a number of things that are going on now that relate directly to what we were being given in this movie by Cameron. And it makes you wonder about Cameron and what he knows, because, of course, he's kind of successively through time. He did another Terminator movie, but having done Avatar and things like that, you can see these advanced concepts weaving through in the work that he's doing. But if you go to that original one and you go to Skynet, this is really a flash forward, and it gives us that piece that when you get around somebody who understands the advanced esoteric concept of the eighth sphere, artificial intelligence, virtual reality versus a human experience and the normal evolutionary track that we're supposed to be on, you can see in the clash in that movie between, because very often in that movie, and I don't think it's just a suspense um, piece, but I think it's over and over again, it's that close to when this Terminator, you may have her and may be able to accomplish its mission of terminating Sarah Connor. So when you get into this, you can really go back and look at this movie and see it as foreshadowing the AI issue, but also having some knowledge of this eighth sphere piece and APOTHEUM. And remember, the time displacement equipment in the movie is directly out of Thomas Townsend Brown. So somebody instantly is doing that. And in the movie, the group Skynet didn't develop the time travel technology, they discovered it. So this is important also, because I think that gets somebody's knowledge base in the script of this movie knows a great deal about the deep underground projects of Thomas Townsend Brown and how they relate to time displacement. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep in here tonight with the eighth sphere and the UFO file, in the eighth sphere AI warning Kona Blue UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Brad Briggs says it's like the Terminator is hunting down Mother Mary.
Oh, wow. That's really true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's a lot of modern myth building inside of it, but it's incredibly canny. And if you were to see the movie, and somebody out here must have seen it when it came out in 1984. Think about the world as it existed, and then flash forward some 40 years later, and here we are, really right on the cusp of it. I saw a demonstration, Boston Dynamics, of these robots that could roll over and attack and all this kind of stuff. They're basically Terminator machines. And so we've been warned, as it were, and that goes back, I think, to Kubrick's movie as well, a series of his movies, but in particular, 2001: A Space Odyssey, because you have HAL there, and that is the artificial intelligence becoming sentient and taking over to this level. And so the warnings are clearly there, and they come through the different work on the science fiction side, because it starts to work on that side of our brains. But if you go a little bit deeper with it, what they're being inspired by is directly from the mystery traditions. And there's a hint there. There's a subconscious warning deep in this. And I'm going to show how the mystery schools put this out and just how misunderstood it was. And I'm also going to say that really, until we started talking about the eighth sphere, its relation to Ahriman in the Steiner work, the wonderful thing about the Steiner work and its impact over the course of a century here, and how he said there'd be a door that would open up in 100 years. And he said that in 1920, where anthroposophy and spiritual science would really have a chance again, because he felt through World War I that the mystery schools had failed with this, which is interesting to think about, that they were set up to kind of prevent this disaster. But it's very interesting, because if we take it on the level of even what we're doing here in the ideas from raising the level of consciousness around the eighth sphere, suddenly that ricocheting of all of these informed, enlightened minds around the eighth sphere piece, that thing starts to pick up a life of its own, and the awareness around it. And this to me is how this information works. So when they let this thing out, um, very early on, and then the mystery schools and people like Steiner come out to correct what was put out. Um, these people are looking very far ahead. They're saying in 100 years, this thing will start to come together. And that's what we're looking at in the period that we're in. As a matter of fact, I would say that all of the mystery material relates directly to this period, because what's fascinating about it is if you look at Casey's work, how advanced is that around Atlantis as an advanced technological culture with a spiritual problem? And then, going with the whole world teacher Blavatsky piece, and then Steiner's whole, the Ahrimanic web surrounding the world and the problem of electricity and the electronic double, things of this nature. These are very advanced technological concepts that will make more sense in our time than they did in theirs. In their time, they're kind of seeing the warm up for this, and they will get to the world wars, and that will give the kind of the horror of what could be accomplished through the technology. But I think that this gets us into the right frame of mind for looking at that. I'm going to read a few things and then take us into where the eighth sphere actually was mentioned for the first time. And what I'll do is I'll swing back to the whole Kona Blue UFO piece, and then we'll go off and take questions.
Sounds good.
Fantastic. How are you doing out there?
Good. Maddie Mosef said, can you explain the eighth sphere? And Roger Z says, the descriptions of the eighth sphere from ancient Indian philosophy, Christian theology, theosophy, and spiritual science spell out a hell realm that is logical.
Yeah, I don't think of it. There have been a lot of different ways of looking at the whole purgatory and things like that come through a religious lens, and I understand how they came about, but I think that rather than ascribing it directly as like hell and things of this nature, let's think it through in terms of human spiritual evolution, and then the interruption of that, the misdirection of that, and the kind of inherent evil around that becomes obvious. But I think that we can start to look at and explore the eighth sphere by thinking about clairvoyant vision. One of the things that Steiner warned about, which I think is fascinating, and it still echoes in this period of time, it's not very well explained, is that one of the Ahrimanic technology techniques would be to give everyone clairvoyance through technology, but it would be a overlapping clairvoyance where it would be different for each individual person. Now, you could imagine if everyone woke up psychic and had real clairvoyant vision the next day, this would be a very different world, as we know. And in Atlantis and in earlier cultures, they had something very much like this. But in this period, even the smallest hint of advantage of secrets, things like that, we could see the way that things play out with the culture is not very developed. Now, what's quite fascinating is on the level that Steiner is talking about it, if we were to start to look into the experiments that we're seeing, and that people, I'm sure, inside the social media companies like Facebook and others would be telling us that technology is being set up to read our minds. That's exactly where all the Elon brain chip stuff comes from. I don't believe for a second that Elon is the kind of guy who walks around wondering if he can help somebody walk again. It doesn't seem like the type to me. But was an interesting overlap, and I'll just tell a little side here story, that Tucker Carlson was talking about being in the same room with, these World Economic Forum types. And recently, somehow he was in the same space with Klaus Schwab, and he starts talking about how Klaus Schwab is going off about how everything in their plans for the future relies on this brain chip idea. Now, then let's weigh that against free speech Elon and the whole Mars obsession plugged into that with, satellites and control. And this whole idea that he's a free speech king and all this stuff and, a space president and all these weird things that, nobody elected this guy for. But just on a basic level, one of the goals that WEF had starting in 2022 was regaining trust. And regaining trust was a major theme at the last Bilderberg meeting as well. So the things like what Elon is doing could very easily be seen through the lens of regaining the trust of the public to, again, misuse it in the future because they were so outed during the COVID op that you had people like Trudeau saying, people who don't take the vaccine are taking up space. They defy our culture. And you remember all the insanity around that. Well, this gets us into interesting territory that there was Tucker Carlson listening to this ranting of Schwab saying that chip is the key to everything that they need to do, the biological, the biometric aspect of the future. They need to integrate that. They can't have the distance anymore. It can't be a phone instructing you what to do. They have to be in your system. Part of the reason for that is an esoteric aspect. It's an occult practice that needs to be played out in their playbook. And the way that it works is inside of a human being, you have a silver cord for development, as the mystery schools talk about it. This is the line between the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, and the Leydig gland. This relates directly to your life force, psychic force, spiritual connection, all the rest. So this idea that you can project your consciousness into some, avatar box and it can go off to Mars or whatever. There's no truth to any of that because your physical organism houses your spiritual self. And so what's interesting about what they need to do is, they've taken all these steps forward to humanity, and this is the AI danger, that what they need to do now is get inside. And the domain, the body is the temple, and your brain in particular is the target for the Ahrimanic forces. That comes directly out of the Steiner literature. So you have to start to wonder, okay, when I'm looking and reading these mystery texts, now I'm getting directly into how this kind of scientific materialism has become this overblown insanity that wants to dominate physical life on Earth through a biometric future. Now, this is, where the power is. This is where the push is, where the money is, where the occult magnetism is. So when things happen, like people become aware of what they're up to, or a concept like the eighth sphere starts to peer through in a place like the ideas room, and we start to open up what this is, it actually sends a signal, even from this lone outpost. It sends a ripple from people starting to discover the nature of what's happening. And this is the way that things work in humanity. There's a magnetism that operates that is something that these elite groups and the WEF types and the Davos crowd, they're not able to. Over and over again, they're able to go to a certain distance, but they're not able to actually contain that. They're very aware, because of their own secret society training of one level or another. They're very aware through what is called the left path. And they're aware of the occult truths embedded in this. This is what they're going for. This is what they're pushing for. They believe that they have the ability to climb up that tree of life, as it were, by using this technological method, and specifically through this mineral targeting. And by going and sort of circumventing around the animal piece in the tree of life. They think that they can get up without having to go through the spiritual stages to become immortal. They can just, go directly through this mineral channel, which is where the technology is taking them, etc. This is a belief, and it comes in through the scientific materialism. It comes in through the Belial work. It comes in through the Ahrimanic aspect. So this is what now we're dealing with, and they're taking kind of the 800-pound gorillas out of the room, and people are starting to get the hint of like, oh, they're trying to teach my kids sex ed at 4 years old or something. They're getting hints. Even an average person who lives in a kind of a dull state driven by entertainment or programming from the media is even they are starting to wonder what's going on here. And when you get to that level, you're close to their big unveiling. But let's face it, and I'm not somebody who looks for these things, but the open kind of parading of occult imagery around the simplest things, like the Super Bowl, we've gotten into a powerful, powerful place. And this brings us into understanding why the eighth sphere is important and why these activities relate directly to this concept that the mysteries let out. That's what we're getting to next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 169, the eighth sphere AI warning, and Kona Blue UFO file. There's more on Kona Blue to bring to you, and a lot has come out in the past couple of days. I'm grateful that one, we have those 56 pages of Kona Blue, which we told you about last year, and also that this incredible FOIA from the Black Vault has come forward about David Grush and the messages that went back and forth between Mellon, Grush, and Kirkpatrick, who was leading this UFO defense office. None of the people involved, in my opinion, are trustworthy. Neither Kirkpatrick nor the Mellon group. But it's interesting to see them positioning themselves. And it's also to see some of these people lying on the record, because I think that helps a great deal, because whenever this stuff gets rolled out, it gets rolled out with a lot of entrainment and marketing about what superheroes these CIA people are for giving us, the truth about the UFO file, when over and over again, we find them over the course of the last 6 years in particular, lying heavily in public. And there's a kind of an eerie trend around this too, which is one of the things that, these types, they like to threaten people with language. This is what, when they get into trouble, when they get exposed, this shows the kind of low-level character that they've been putting out there. And one of the things that Greenwald caught when he was putting out this work through the Black Vault was that Sean Cahill is one of the people used in this Mellon UFO threat op, was saying that guys like Greenwald should be careful about exposing their router address.
What?
Yeah, and think about this. This reminds me very much of the Elizondo thing. One of the reasons they pulled him, they did the old vaudeville trick with the hook, pulling him off the stage, because he was doing things like that. And these people, when they get challenged, they resort back to kind of the creep that they are. They can't hide the creep, but the inner creep, were why they were selected in the first place. And so this kind of counterintelligence arrogance comes out. And so here's this guy, Cahill, on Twitter, basically threatening people who have, inadvertently exposed the fact that this whole thing, the TTSA and ATIP and all the BS, that these people have really threatened the thing that they were supposed to bring out. And, the CIA was going to back, and the UFO threat was going to be a part of it, and millions of dollars were involved and all the rest of it. And instead, these people over and over again were shown to be deceiving the public. And so, they had to keep coming up with different versions of this thing. When you get around the UFO file, you can see the desperation when the rhetoric changes. And whenever they apply this aggressive rhetoric on the counter intel side, that's why it's so dangerous when you have people like Rogan and Tucker Carlson promoting the likes of Gary Nolan, who, as I've said, is very close with Anthony Fauci, and praises him publicly and all the rest. And Tucker Carlson in Lifetime is taking messages from Elizondo about Kona Blue and thinking he's getting intel. That's a very dangerous situation. So the fact is that people like Carlson and Rogan may want to know things about the UFO file. They're going to the wrong people. You never go to the CIA for that kind of stuff. And it's funny because Tucker Carlson was talking about how Mike Pompeo had set up to assassinate Julian Assange. And, this is something that Pompeo tried to pull off in 2018. And, that's the assassination of a private citizen. And, you hear all the time, like, oh, the CIA is reformed. They'd never do this stuff that you recount for the past 8 decades, all the crimes that they've committed, the torture and all the rest. Well, here they were just a couple of years ago setting up the assassination of Assange. And here's Tucker Carlson talking about that. And yet he's taking messages from a guy who spent the better part of 25 years working directly for that agency. So there's a disconnect here, and they've been able to glamorize these people. And the way that they've done it is to pretend that they're anti-government. That government, we need to get the truth. And I have the truth of the UFO file and all the rest of it. And they've rolled out who? Well, billionaire Mellon and his DOD, Mayor of Area 51 background. Elizondo, Gary Nolan, and it's interesting with Gary Nolan because he admitted at the SALT conference, I still have the audio tape, and he said, yeah, we use the threat aspect in order to drive attention and drive investment, So there he is saying, yeah, we're pretending there's a UFO threat when there isn't one. This is the nature of the sickness. And he's also like, and I'm looking out there and I don't want to just see $50,000, as a donation. I want big money for my, nonprofit. So this is the kind of sick world that these people live in. And it's financially driven, it's attention driven. So that whole UFO field has become sick. And what's fascinating is we're at the very height of being able to get to the heart of the mystery. That's the UFO file research. That's the thing that we're doing here on this program, and that so many of you in the Ideas Room are doing along with us. This becomes then a totally different approach using, real methods, understanding things about the esoteric aspect driven home here, and getting away from the threat, getting away from the overly technological aspect of this, dealing with it, dealing and bringing forward the advanced technology piece, but not holding it up as, on the altar, as it were. So this becomes a very important difference. I think it is important to point that out and to let you know the kind of crazy things that are involved when the CIA moves in on the X technology UFO file piece. And we've seen these people really act very strangely indeed. Miss Olivia.
Feeling Better Naturally says Gigi calls it techno-Satanism. And Song of Prayer says, I wonder how much pressure the initiates of black magic feel they are under to pull off their 8th sphere trap in terms of the timeline of cycles and our proximity to the cosmic center / light.
Very interesting. The word trap there is very interesting and probably fortuitous as well. Let's walk back through this a little bit. Now, before Steiner came out, in 1883, A.P. Sinnott was a journalist who came from a banker family and was very interested in theosophy, and Blavatsky encouraged him and his articles and thought, this guy's really getting some good stuff together. So he started getting his own contact with the masters. And she started to look at his work and think, he's doing some interesting things. He came out with a book called Esoteric Buddhism. And in there was a reference to the 8th sphere. Now, the 8th sphere had been around there, but it had not been revealed. And it had been in and out of mystical texts over the years. And as I said, it was in a very early edition of these quite fascinating tarot cards that came out early on, which came in symbolically, but it's funny, if you go back, the place that they occupied in Italy in, say, the 14th century, they came in under the guise of having a really well-trained family, a family that could be highly educated through the symbolism of the tarot. And so it's quite interesting the way that they utilized it. What's interesting to me about the eighth sphere and Sinnott bringing it through is that he's getting all this information supposedly from this contact with these ascended masters. Now, almost immediately, Blavatsky rings a warning bell that he's taken something and spoken out of turn about it, and that he's taken it incorrectly. And you might think to yourself, what is it, about the eighth sphere and the fact that Sinnott identified it with the moon, so what? This is where the deep, deep heart of the mystery goes. Because if you can understand why this is crucial and why it shows up directly in Steiner's work after the fact, with this weird interim with C.G. Harrison in the middle, you get a hint of the battles that go on behind the scenes in the mystery schools that directly relate to its impact on the culture. And this one in particular is interesting. So what happens is Sinnott says there's an eighth sphere in this cosmology of humanity's development, and it is the moon, giving it a solid material place. Now, the eighth sphere, the way that Steiner defines it, is it's a realm that's being developed, a virtual realm that is developed by Ahriman in order to disappear humanity and to create an artificial step in the spiritual evolutionary track, so we never get to that place that we're going to spiritually. So the spiritual development is completely cut off, and we are rerouted, and there's very dim consciousness about this. And the eighth sphere is a very exciting place because it deals with creative imagination and clairvoyant vision. But clairvoyant vision, as I was mentioning, the way that they were discussing it then sounds very much like virtual reality now. And what they're going to do through the brain chip technology and other things that we see around this incredible VR development is they're going to place you in different situations and have you live out different roles and things like that by stimulating nerves in your brain and all the rest. But by doing that, they are creating a false reality, and they are using your energy body to do it. And that builds this sphere. This is part of the trap that Ahriman has in wait, as it were. But it's interesting to go back and think about Blavatsky bringing forward this information, and then herself being challenged by a number of these left path groups. So there's a story here, and I've put this on the record before in relation to Blavatsky. It works something like this. The mystery schools in the 1840s get to a point where they realize with scientific materialism, they're in such a jam that they decide to roll out all of these techniques for people to achieve a kind of a higher consciousness as a buffer against this thing that's coming in. And it is an Ahrimanic thing, but they can see humanity being overwhelmed by it. And what happens is through people like the Fox sisters and these psychic groups and the craze of spiritualism, with America as the leader, it spreads all over Europe. And what happens is everyone gets fascinated with seances and wrappings and interactions with the other world. And there's a lot of communication that happens. There are a number of things that are set up. One of the things that comes in there is the use of somnambulism. And I've often identified a person who gets forgotten in all this, which is Emma Britton, who started Theosophy with Blavatsky. She's in Boston. Blavatsky's in New York. And about whom Blavatsky said there was never a better medium that she encountered. It's a pretty heavy compliment coming from her. She'd been all over the world. Emma Britton, when she was young, as a teenager, was used by groups And in those groups, one of the groups called the Orphic Circle, they had Charles Darwin, they had Benjamin Disraeli, the future prime minister of England. I mean, these were high level people, and they were using her in a trance state to get information on the meaning of life on one hand, and on the other hand, national secrets and things that they could use for national security and other purposes. And she gives in her fascinating biography very great detail about this group. And the group subsequently got identified as something called the Ghost Club. This was the name that people thought it was, but the inside name, the kind of inside baseball name for it, was the Orphic Circle. And
although the Ghost Club is a very cool name.
Indeed. One of the incredible things about Britain is she remembered waking up in the middle of one of these trance states. And she's 14 years old, and the whole room is, getting trashed with this poltergeist activity. And there are 3 strange luminous beings there. And everyone who was at this mediumistic meeting is freaking out because they don't know what's going on. And there's a woman who's leading it who goes up to her and yells in her ear, "Go back to sleep, go back to sleep," because they're figuring whatever it is that she's unleashed here, they have to put her back in trance to close the door on it. But such remarkable scenes and remarkable abilities. This would all come through later, the same types of abilities through Edgar Cayce. And a lot of this getting information from the other side and how this is going to work was set up through the mystery schools saying, we need to put this information out there. I've discussed this in a number of shows. The only kind of capsule version I want to give to it so we understand it in terms of this is that those guys had a decision to make. And the decision that they made initially was to back someone like Blavatsky as an intermediate character who could bridge the 2 worlds because of her own heavy talents as a psychic medium. Now, what's interesting is they decided shortly after that she was a bigger problem than the problems that they were having. And this is where you get a huge explosion of information and things coming out. ISIS Unveiled, The Secret Doctrine. It's just an explosive period. Atlantis, the antediluvian world. I mean, the world was really getting information that had been held in secret for thousands of years. By the time you get to Steiner, he is still clarifying the nature of the 8th sphere. The intermediate step between Theosophy and Steiner is C.G. Harrison. And unfortunately, there's very little on the record that we can tell you about C.G. Harrison, except for the content of 7 lectures that he gave to something called the Berrien Society in 1894, a few years after Blavatsky's death. And that's what we're going to get into next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the 8th Sphere AI Warning, Kona Blue UFO file. We're going deep, deep into the 8th Sphere tonight and the AI aspect that comes across over time as a warning to us here in the 21st century. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Kel says, did Steiner ever mention anything about this being a simulation of sorts? And Melanie Kay said, could the 8th sphere already be here with the time loop continuing with an ultimate reset? Were Adam and Eve simply the last ultimate reset? If each time loop lasts 6,000 years, it makes sense how we would only remember so far back.
Yeah, I mean, Adam and Eve go back hundreds of thousands of years. And so in a mystery tradition, you're going way, way back. There's a fascinating Cayce reading about a woman in Nevada, speaking of reincarnation tracks. And he said, in these caves there between, this part of Nevada, you'll find the marks that you made there 10 million years ago. So, there's been different developmental stages of humanity, but we at least know 10 million years as a date. The humanity that we're kind of familiar with probably came up around 250,000 years ago. In traditional evolutionary patterns and, Darwinism and all that kind of stuff, it's very different. And they have us coming on the scene in modern, a lot of the modern interpretations of this, they're caught in a weird place because their discoveries keep showing much, 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 much older development. And so we're at an interesting place as a culture on this. There's no real good solution out there. The National Geographic world sort of lives in a fantasy. But let's think about it as very, very, everything's being much, much earlier. There's a fascinating reading that Casey gives talking about this great meeting of all of the nations on Earth trying to fight off, what sounds talks about these great beasts, so these dinosaurs. And he gives the date 50,722 BC. So that technology, that meeting, that communication, worldwide communication broadcast, 50,722 BC. We have Neanderthal, we have all these kind of things in the background, but we don't have any kind of real history to work from. So instantly we're at a huge disadvantage when it comes to that. That's where the mystery traditions kind of fill in a lot of the background and give us a much better idea of what went down there, which I think is so, so crucial. And, there's a great comment from Graham Hancock talking about how we're a culture with amnesia. It's because there's a huge chapter missing before we get to the Egyptian civilization. But one thing I'll say about the eighth sphere aspect is it is one of the things that was said there, and that's interesting, is that you exist in it. You have the ability, if you wake up and suck into this imaginative VR reality over time, you are operating inside the eighth sphere. It's funny, I mentioned these NASA projects dealing with Mars and how I felt, instead of being on Mars, these people seem like they were in the eighth sphere. I'm going to show you a couple of those. And then show you how this artwork contrasts against some artwork that was developed in Steiner's time by Helena Klimt. And the interesting sort of contrast there gives us a great deal about the sucked out, lifeless nature of the eighth sphere versus, something that has a spiritual core and, inspired artists like Kandinsky and all kinds of fascinating art movements. All right, so some of these, have the kind of basic sort of trolling around on Mars things. And this one in particular I found interesting because it had that kind of eighth sphere signature to it. And again, this is a NASA-sponsored project about life on Mars. In some of these, you can see them sort of trolling around with these eighth sphere type creatures. And the artists Nicholas Kahn and Richard Selznick, and Mars Visions, and previously they had Apollo Predictions. I found an incredible corollary with this to the same thing that was going on with Suzanne Treister in the CERN Tarot deck. There's a kind of lifeless thing, but it seems incredibly potent in terms of information. It just seems like the goals of what they're talking about have that kind of lifeless, zombified eighth sphere aspect. This one I thought was interesting because it's almost like a Mars eighth sphere Nimza. And we have some interesting shows coming up on Nimza, so this could get interesting. One of the other things that I noticed in the work of these artists who were sponsored by NASA were these strange kind of creatures with these beaks. And they're some sort of astronaut, but they seem to be encountering our astronauts.
That's interesting. It's been reminding me of during the Black Plague.
Oh, yeah.
Images of
Yes. Yeah.
creepy.
Excellent point. The last one I'll show in this whole thing is this one, which again gives me that kind of, isn't that like eighth sphere vibe?
Yes.
There is something to it. So for me, the fact that NASA was coming up with this, and the nature of it being, hey, this is life on Mars, Well, if it was that lifeless and anti-human, then it'd be nothing to aspire to there as well.
Right. Here's the question, Najat Madri. Who funded these artists? Any connections to black budgets or the usual cast of characters? I'd like to remind everyone, they used our tax dollars for this.
True. Although, I'll
unnecessary project.
Absolutely. That doesn't even bother me so much.
Now it bothers me.
Because, there's all sorts of artistic interpretations and, somebody out there may have liked what they did. The problem that I had with it was more the goal of the group sponsoring it inside NASA. They were there kind of portraying this very kind of zombified, unhappy existence on Mars. And for me, it was a hint of like, this is the world that you're projecting into in the eighth sphere. Just a quick thing on Hilma Klimt. I want to say this, that her art was so advanced, and she came to be originally a follower of Theosophy and then of Rudolf Steiner. But when she met Steiner at the Goetheanum, this very interesting meeting that they have where he says, I don't think you should release your paintings, not for a good 75 years, because they're so advanced for the culture that in a 7,500-year window, that culture will be able to accept them. And in fact, she held a great many of them back from public display. And she's very interesting in her own right, having gone through some personal tragedies. She had a sister that died, and it opened up part of this pondering, philosophically opened her up spiritually to a number of interesting concepts. And she retired in Sweden. And it's only really in the last, say, 10 years that her work has come out so powerfully. And the essence of the higher wisdom breaking through something like the eighth sphere seems to be over and over again a theme in her work.
Oh, magnificent.
And really bringing that forward. We put some of that in the thumbnail as well. But I think the contrast there that we're getting with, this kind of anthroposophical artist versus these weird, lifeless Mars people gives us a hint of what they're talking about when they talk about, how the eighth sphere, how people disappear into the eighth sphere. Now, let's go back now. So we had Sinnott prematurely lets out the eighth sphere information and lets it out incorrectly. Then a couple years later in The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky tries to clean it up. But there's also problems with Blavatsky and some of the things that she's being given. In particular, this idea, there's a powerful aspect inside the mystery schools that says that Yahweh, who, is there as the kind of God of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, he has set up the moon, and he has made sure that the moon has a heavy material aspect to it that cannot be sucked in by Ahriman.
Wait, who's done this?
Yahweh.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting is in Theosophy, they try to pack Yahweh in as this moon god and like forget him and that whole thing. So there's a kind of an anti Yahweh and an anti-Christianity thing that creeps in to Theosophy, which wasn't there originally. And this is by design. Now, what's interesting is, in short, what Steiner is saying is that through the different types of clairvoyant imagination that's being sucked out of humanity, it's being helped to develop this eighth sphere. But simultaneous with it is the need to adopt the mineral aspects of the earth to develop it. And so basically, one of the things that in the cosmology Yahweh is being credited for in Steiner's work is really developing the moon as such a realm that Ahriman cannot basically take control of the entire earth, because the moon is a preventative to that. So this is very crucial, and he would have a tremendous advantage if this were not so. So when we get out of this phase, you do see very clearly that Blavatsky kind of spanks Sinnott and expects him to do a huge correction. Instead, he puts out a little more work about the eighth sphere. It contains the same errors about how the eighth sphere is the moon, etc. Now, you and I, not being in the mystery school, may not understand exactly why this is such an important, powerful piece, but let's try here a little bit. And I'm going to do that through quoting C.G. Harrison and what he had to say about it, and then quoting Steiner. And then we'll go to your questions. How does that sound?
Good.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Eighth Sphere AI Warning, Kona Blue UFO file. Right now, we're going into where the mystery school saw the eighth sphere and the dangers of the artificial intelligence becoming a secondary realm and us projecting our consciousness into this virtual reality without being mind, body, and spirit, which is what we need to spiritually evolve. And really the danger of the interruption of that spiritual evolutionary track and, seeing that kind of taken off with Ahriman and Lucifer guiding us into a false evolutionary track through a false planet, this eighth sphere that's developed. By the way, the eighth sphere isn't something that we can see with a telescope, but it is something, according to the mysteries, that you can see through visionary clairvoyance. So that's the place where it rests, as it were. It's not going to be observable by a telescope. All right. Anything out there before
Now, John Lottery wanted to know, has anyone been able to decode Hilma's work?
Well, what's interesting is I think that it leaves a very kind of heavy impression on people. And I believe that this is part of what Steiner was getting across. And it's interesting because he tried over and over again with different types of anthroposophical art to bring this essence of the battle, as it were, on the spiritual planes. So he was particularly sensitive to that. And I think that you can see, and they, of course, have those fantastic showings once in a while of her artwork, just as they do of Delshau's work, which I think has, again, a piece of this, and it's working through technology in Delshau's case. But those things only started to come back to us in the last 20 to 30 years. Klimt really in the past decade or two, and then we've only had a few decades of Delshau's work coming back. So absolutely worthy of further explanation and further exploration. Harrison. So now, Harrison, I will say this about him. He's around in 1894 giving these lectures. There's some suggestion in my own curiosity that it's actually Steiner himself at a young age pulling off an extraordinary feat of being 33 years old and giving these lectures. Now, later he'll comment on the lectures, so it doesn't make sense really that he would comment on his own lectures. So maybe it's not true. However, there's something kind of strange about the presence of our friend Harrison in all of this, and the fact that he knew everything, including Blavatsky's occult imprisonment, the eighth sphere. He already is tied into everything. He's also using the term spiritual science a good decade before Steiner comes on the scene and remarks his own work is going to be called spiritual science. This could be a teacher of Steiner's. It could be a direct teacher. So he could be directly in the lineage. There's some possibility that it is Steiner. Age-wise, it's not so far off. And after all, this guy is quite a mystery, although I have quite a track on him. And supposedly he doesn't die until 5 years after Steiner. So, maybe it's not a separate person, but certainly an unusual overlap, shall we say. This is lecture 5 of the Transcendental Universe, a phenomenal work which is basically a front row seat to the War of the Mystery Schools in that period. I'm going to give a little bit of this and then a little bit from Steiner's lecture on the Eighth Sphere. It's going to give us a hint that there's something deep going on here. Okay, this is Harrison. My task this evening is a difficult one. The truths which I shall endeavor to convey are fragments of knowledge pertaining to some of the very highest mysteries, and full comprehension of which requires the development of faculties wholly latent in the majority of human beings, but very feebly developed in the West, even among initiates. Think about that. I want to say this thing about fragment is a hint. There's two major hints we've been able to figure out about the mystery schools in this period. One, that you refer to somebody who is an initiate by their initial. So, you call Gurdjieff G, you call Steiner R or S, and there's a reason, there's a lineage for how to do this. And it comes out of the Rosicrucian Western initiatory tradition. The other thing I think that's interesting also is they always use the term fragments. It's like we need to understand and have it brought home over and over again that we're dealing with fragments of very advanced information that can be really developed. And the fragment aspect, I think, is important because you need to work directly with the fragments. It's funny, the original title of Ouspensky's book about Gurdjieff wasn't In Search of the Miraculous. That was actually the name of his own lectures. It was called Fragments of an Unknown Teaching. So much of this are fragments of this unknown teaching coming directly out of the mysteries. Here is Harrison saying, even the initiates have a dullness to them in the West. That's quite extraordinary. It will be my duty to explain to the best of my ability certain facts in connection, and he uses connection with an X throughout this book, which I find very interesting X-steganography there, with a mystery known as the mystery of the eighth sphere, which is a key to the problem of evil in the universe. Think about that.
Wait, that's worth saying again.
Certain facts it'll be my duty to explain to the best of my ability in connection with a mystery known as the mystery of the eighth sphere, which is a key to the problem of evil in the universe.
That's huge.
Fascinating, isn't it? It is sevenfold, and each of its minor mysteries is correlated to the sevenfold mystery of life, and there's 7 planes of consciousness. Okay, right off the bat, you're in very deep territory. Now, I'm well aware that there are many occultists who say the subject ought not to be brought before the public at all. Remember, Steiner said it was the highest secret of the mystery schools before it was stumbled out. Now, I'm well aware there are many occultists who say the subject ought not to be brought before the public at all, and the object to the very name being mentioned, and some of them have been endeavoring to alarm my good friend Mr. Blank. Was that Mr. Steiner? Could be. The name is omitted. Who has cautioned me to be careful when I admit to these lectures. In reply, because you're subject to intense psychic attack if you let something out and you're associated with these schools. One of the things that Harrison seems to be saying is, I know, like Blavatsky knows, but I'm not part of a school. I don't have an oath to a school. Therefore, I can release it. So he says, Mr. Blank, let's say Mr. X.
Wait, can I pause you right there?
Yeah.
If he was not a member of a school, how did he come across this knowledge?
Well, the same question, what's interesting is he raises the same question about Blavatsky. So obviously he understood something, that they had something in common.
Okay. But he doesn't explain where he got the information?
He does not.
Okay.
In reply to such person, but he's clearly knowledgeable, and Steiner puts him, in retrospect, and going back to his work, puts him on a level with Blavatsky. In reply to such persons, it's due to myself to say I'm breaking no oath, violating no confidence. These lectures were advertised in public journals, in fact, and all who chose to attend then are welcome. I regret to be obliged to differ from many persons who I hold in the highest respect as to whether or not the times are ripe for mentioning these subjects. They've been mentioned prudently or imprudently and are familiar to all who have taken an interest in the Theosophical movement, which is more than they are being thought about. And I am convinced with my own mind that under the circumstances, the continuation of the policy of total silence hitherto observed is less prudent than guarded speech. Now, when we consider and the immense mass of knowledge has already been made public, which through, to all appearances, frozen at its source, must inevitably thaw in the coming century, I humbly submit that it is wiser to dig trenches than to risk a devastating flood. The first person, however, to profane the mysteries unconsciously was Mr. A.P. Sinnett, the author of Esoteric Buddhism, a book which made considerable sensation when it came out, but which contains nothing new, and it is true, nothing true that is new. As he was the first to make public the information that there is an eighth sphere and a mystery connected with it of which he is ignorant, it may be as well to say that both of these statements are true. But when he proceeds to say that the eighth sphere is the moon, he gives utterance to one of those half-truths that are more misleading than total falsehoods. As we as well give as a definition of man the aggregate of the chemical constituents of a decomposing body, the mystery is indeed the mystery of death in dealing with the eighth sphere. Now, this is 1894. Steiner doesn't do real work on the eighth sphere for another 15 years. 1883 was when Sinnett came out with it. This is 11 years after that. A couple of years later, 1885, Blavatsky deals with all of it. This is 9 years after that. So he's a very interesting and important intermediate step. He also discusses what happened with Madame Blavatsky, and I went through that in the last episode about her occult imprisonment, which is something as a theme I've gone back to a number of times because it shows the split in the schools and how they operate, and how for political purposes, some of those schools are driven into the kind of secret society activity of the left schools, that kind of selfish, self-fulfilling aspects. But something dramatic is happening here in the Harrison book, and it sets up what Steiner is going to do in relation to the eighth sphere. And Steiner's going to draw in Ahriman, who's only a fleeting mention in Blavatsky's work. Steiner is going to put the Persian personification of evil front and center for this astral force that's going to come through the technology in the 21st century. This is where the major key in all this is. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Here we are tonight in the 8th Sphere AI Warning episode, X Series 169, also covering the Kona Blue UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions here momentarily as I'm getting through this as quickly as I can. I want to mention also, if you're new here, especially, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter. That keeps us in touch and gets us around all the heavy, and I mean, if I could tell you how heavy the censorship is on the work that we do, it would blow your mind. But I don't waste time on it. But I will say the best way to get around it is to be on that newsletter list. You'll get it once a week. It's going to let you know about the incredible interviews that we have coming up for you, mind-blowing X Series episodes and presentations, including the May 3rd presentation of The Craze in the Hot Zone. This is Atlantis. You've never seen anything like this. And this one goes deep with a very deep production aesthetic as well. But I've spent a lot of time on it, and you're going to be fascinated by what we've uncovered. May 3rd, 8 p.m. Eastern, and it's a 2-hour presentation. You don't want to miss it. Make sure you're signed up for that newsletter. Stand up and be counted. Get behind the work that we're doing. Subscribe, and let us know that we're working in tandem here with you there in the ideas room. I also want to mention that as these things come up, and things like Kona Blue and some of the things we've talked about and come out to a broader public, it's very important the role that the ideas room has played in developing the ideas before they hit the churning of the public machine and Twitter and all the rest of it. There's a kind of foundation that we can lay with so many of these things. And, I go back to the Trump Tesla work that we did in 2018 and how much of that, it's just people are just getting caught up on that now. And we have a tendency to do that in this show. It's interesting because another thing that Joe Rogan played on his show was this little Judge Napolitano clip, which, we made this little story of Napolitano's talking to Trump about a year ago. I heard it and it was on some obscure podcast, and I realized the impact. Every once in a while, when you get around certain stories, especially around the Kennedy assassination, I can always hear when there's a breakthrough. And one of them was this Nixon tape that came out where he's talking with Richard Helms about how he can help get the CIA off the hook for participating in the assassination. What's interesting is Napolitano was on this podcast and giving the story about one of his last conversations with President Trump, because they have this up again, down again relationship. And what happened was he's talking to Trump and he's saying, one of the things you promised you'd do before you leave office, this is a little bit before Trump is leaving, he says, was that you'd release the Kennedy files. And Trump said, I can't do it. And Napolitano was like, you promised to do it. Don't treat the public like children or whatever. And Trump said to Napolitano, Andrew, if you understood what was in those files, you couldn't do it either. You wouldn't believe it. Now, we started to, I think in December of 2022, put that out there. And thank God Napolitano started to repeat it more and more, and people started to pick up on it. Finally, in the episode of Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson, there they are playing this clip and talking about this and getting it on the record. And it's so funny because, there we were putting this little piece out that was so important that Napolitano had this conversation, and he caught the hint of what Trump had seen, and in a way, all of us can see through the eyes of what Trump had seen that would, to put it on a level where what could not be released. And I guarantee you it relates directly to the UFO file. That's the big takeaway there. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay. Back to HPB. Alchemical Wedding says maybe they tried to send HPB to the eighth sphere, but the Mahatmas helped release her, causing her to go more left-wing and away from Christianity. A very heavy price was paid for the attack on her.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's very, very astute. I think those are the steps that took place. And it's funny because, of course, Charlotte is the author of the Eidolon, or the Eidolons book. And it is this term, Eidolons, which is interesting because it represents a kind of a spiritual doppelganger that Blavatsky had. And in the 6-year anniversary of the X Series episode, which is coming up in May now, I'm going to expand on that piece to show how they reflected back her master to her under the guise of an astral shell. This is something that I think is going to ride very closely with some of that explanation there. So that one particularly catches my interest. And really a good description. I'm going to read, first of all, I'm going to show you what Steiner would have looked like in 1894 at the age of 33 when these lectures by Harrison took place. This is Steiner in that period.
Excellent.
And you could see that certainly, you could see him showing up on this London circuit as the head of this Borean society and giving those lectures, or someone closely connected with him, but certainly age-wise, it falls right in the pocket there. Later, of course, Steiner is directly connected with Annie Besant, who will put him in charge of the German wing of Theosophy. I want to say a couple of things about Besant. She was an exceptional personality. She was manipulated dramatically. But at a certain point, she gets manipulated by this Hindu group which wants political action in India. And she does, in fact, help Gandhi, create freedom in India and home rule. But some of the forces, the political forces, get away from the spiritual aspects going on there. Now, here's what's very interesting. And, you find out so many things. The story around Krishnamurti and Annie Besant is quite fascinating because she decides with Ledbetter and these strange Hindu groups that the world teacher needs to come now and not in the 21st century as Blavatsky had envisioned it. Now they decide they're going to push through, Lord Maitreya, and that, the vehicle is going to be this advanced Hindu boy, Krishnamurti. And Krishnamurti was quite fascinating indeed. But when that all fails and Krishnamurti says, I'm going to dissolve Theosophy and this order of the star they set up for me, I'm done with this whole thing. He got very discouraged when they were feeding him messages when he had these different meetings to take, etc. And his brother was sick, had pneumonia. And they said, oh, he'll be fine. Don't worry about it. The masters told us he's going to be okay. And so he takes this boat ride to give these lectures in India. And his brother Nitya dies. This disillusionment allowed him to see through the kind of opportunism that was happening there. That's when he goes into the dissolving the order of the star and these other things. But what I found interesting, and many of you may not know, is that Ledbetter and Besant in 1932, after failing to force this whole world teacher through Krishnamurti and, greatest intentions in the world, but it is forcing your will on the world. They claimed that Blavatsky had come back through a boy who was drowning at the age of 15 years old, and Blavatsky slipped in to his body and was going to, now that was going to be the world teacher. And so there was a quick.
Wow. So she was a walk-in.
Yeah. Now, this is interesting. That Hindu group, which was behind this, what I believe, behind this original push to move Theosophy into a totally Eastern system and eliminate the Western Christian aspect. This is very interesting because I think that this was all a strange charade by these Hindus to do this, and using an elderly now Blavatsky and Ledbetter to try to pull it off, because what happens is they decide after a little while nobody's buying this. And then they're like, oh, well, the boy went off to study with the masters and he's not going to be the world teacher. Don't worry about it. That's strange. And it shows that they were hooked on this idea really until very late, like very close to their own, deaths, that they were still pushing this idea of the world teacher coming through. And so their obsession with having the world teacher come through a body and preparing it that way, and their own impatience around this was the undoing of Theosophy. But you can see that, as advanced as they were in other areas, this is the temptation really to, kind of play God, as it were. Absolutely fascinating. Okay, now Steiner and what he has to say to us about the eighth sphere and AI, and then your questions.
Mm-hmm.
And Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Doing great. I got great stuff.
Excellent. Okay. So remember, AP Senate mentions the eighth sphere. Blavatsky publicly reprimands him. He comes back, and instead of improving on it, he does kind of a worse version of it. Senate will fade in the background, and then out will come C.G. Harrison. Somehow is connected to Steiner. Don't know how. And he will come out in 1894 and correct the whole situation on one level, but also say, I know I need to be guarded in my language, etc. But there's a lot of anthroposophy before anthroposophy in Harrison's piece. And Steiner will speak of him in such glowing terms that you can see it's either a huge influence on him, or he knows him, or it's him. So Steiner gives us really quite a mystery there to go along with. And what he's saying is that the human being has this spirituality that they can cultivate. And what happens is it's drawn, and I'll use some of Steiner's actual sketches. It is drawn away, and the Ahrimanic forces aim at the individual to draw it into these 8 spheres. This is one of the shots of a human being being targeted in this fashion. Coming up later will be Crowley's kind of version of this whole thing and kind of embracing the 8th sphere, and the character Lamb really being an inhabitant of this very same type of plane. We can think of Lamb as an actual inhabitant of the 8th sphere. And what is it that Crowley calls him? The way. Well, he's the way into the 8th sphere. And, you know, we've said it again on this show, the incredible resemblance of Lamb with the whole gray alien piece cannot be underestimated or avoided. Another inhabitant and the creator of that 8th sphere environment, that's Steiner's sculpture of Ahriman. So we get the hint there of Steiner, you know, investing directly and showing us this is what this looks like. You know, this is my best artistic interpretation of this thing. And it was funny because while he's spending that time, and he's a great sculptor, interestingly enough, but while he's spending that time doing it, he starts to feel like he's being embedded in concrete himself. When he tunes into Ahriman, he feels a heaviness. This is the heavy materialism of this Ahrimanic force. Couple of things here. This is 1915, the best lecture that Steiner gave on the 8th sphere. I'll give you a little bit of this and then your question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's do this. October 18th, 1915. Now, this is Steiner. It's very difficult indeed to speak of the so-called 8th sphere, which was referred to openly for the first time by Mr. Sinnott. One cannot say that he gave information about it, for what he said was a fallacy. You can certainly realize why it's difficult to speak about this subject. For again, it must be emphasized that our language has been coined for the outer material world, and the 8th sphere was regarded as a secret matter until it was mentioned by Sinnott. In another place, Steiner will say it was one of the top secret, if not the main secret of the mystery schools. Harrison, as you might recall, said it was the key to understanding evil. That's pretty dramatic. It means the 8th sphere is not something just like looking at the planetary chain of evolution or something. It's got a very deep association with humanity. Consequently, there are not many words that can be used for characterizing the 8th sphere. The fact that all mention was avoided for so long will also enable you to realize what is involved when one speaks of it. You will therefore have to take the aphoristic remarks I shall make today as a kind of introductory exposition, given with the object of throwing out certain indications, which, to begin with, can only be a small contribution to the subject. It is to be hoped, however, that there will be opportunities for saying more some later time. There's always this hint that you're going to get more later if you demonstrate that you can absorb this information on a level and not abuse it or be confused by it. So this happens over and over again around the 8th sphere. As a matter of fact, if you compare this with what Harrison wrote in 1894, 21 years earlier, it almost sounds like exactly the same thing, as if they've both been sat down and given the speech in the mystery school, like when you get around the 8th sphere, this is how you approach it. You'll have realized in the lecture yesterday that the eighth sphere cannot be anything that belongs to the material world, for I have shown you that the greatest fallacy in Sinnott's statement is that the physical moon is directly connected to the eighth sphere. I try to make it comprehensible that the actual foundation of the error consists in the fact that this pointed to something material and physical. From this, you'll be able to conjecture, if not fully understand, that what is called the eighth sphere can have nothing directly to do with anything within the material world. That is to say, what can be perceived by man's senses or thought out on the basis of sensory perception has no part in the eighth sphere. So it'll be useless to look for the eighth sphere anywhere in the material world. This is a realm that is based on the projection of clairvoyant vision and thought and imagination. You now have indications by means of which some approach can be made in thought to a conception of the eighth sphere. I've said the eighth sphere is something to do with the residue left from the old moon and its evolution. So much you can gather from the studies you have pursued in the course of time that we have pursued. I tried to make it clear in the lecture yesterday that on the old moon, man's natural mode of perception was visionary and imaginative in character, so that any substantiality to be discerned in the eighth sphere must be found with this kind of vision. That is to say, it must be presumed at the outset that the eighth sphere is found. I'm going to say it again. That is to say, it must be presumed at the outset that the eighth sphere is found by way of visionary imagination. Now, this is interesting because what he's telling us is, first of all, you need to know this is all about a realm you project yourself into. So it's a spiritual, mental place, and it doesn't have physical materiality the way that we understand that. That's why looking for the eighth sphere is not something that we can do on a physical basis. However, it's being formed and will take on a material aspect. The problem is, and the way that we understand materiality, we'd be looking for like a version of the moon out there. Now, it's interesting because Steiner actually takes a crack at showing its relationship to us. And there's a very simple drawing that he put there, but you can see down here that the eighth sphere overlaps directly with the Earth, and that this is the developmental stage that we're in the middle of. The problem with the eighth sphere is that it's been artificially created in the Steiner cosmology. It's been artificially created by this Ahrimanic force. Here we are moving on this totally different spiritual evolutionary track, and this thing shows up to suck us in. So it could suck us in through war. It can, suck us in through these various things, glamorization. And the goal of it is to take the human essence and spirit it away into this eighth sphere where Ahriman is the master of the realm. And, there's the polarity of Ahriman and Lucifer. And I won't get into the Luciferic part because will take us off track. But what's important, I think, to consider, what Steiner's trying to get across, is when you get into this period where the Ahrimanic manipulation of the human race starts to get us technologically pulled in through virtual reality, through giving everyone their own clairvoyance, a la the internet, a la a chip in our brain and all the rest of it, that you're at the doorway of the eighth sphere. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're going to take your questions.
Okay, we're going to start with this one. Cameron, do you think Steiner was destined to live longer and have a bigger impact on society, but was thwarted by adversarial powers, or was he destined to die at 65, having given everything?
Yeah, he dies at 64, and he is actually poisoned, which doesn't kill him immediately, but over time weakens his, you could say, his immune system. I would say that's a really interesting question. My own way of looking at it is I would agree with you that he was meant to be around longer and have a I mean, he has this dramatic impact, but obviously, had he been here, it would have been different. There's two interesting things that come up along this line. One is that Steiner himself mentioned to his doctor, Ida Wigman, that when he spent time in the spiritual realm, physically, he deteriorated to a certain degree by spending too much time there and not sort of embodying his physical life. So he's going over into the spiritual realm. He's doing all this work and he's bringing that work back, but his physical shell is deteriorating on a certain basis. So this process was already, that was happening. It's very interesting because during World War II, Edgar Cayce will give a series of readings, and the source always warned him to do 2 a day. But because he kept getting these mail sacks of people wanting to know about, loved ones in World War II and stuff, he got obsessed with satisfying everyone. And so he was doing 10 readings a day. And the reading source itself started to say, if you don't stop, you're gonna deteriorate because you're operating with this very high psychic frequency, and you have like a physical interface with it. But if you're doing it, 10 times a day, the charge is too high and it's going to defeat you physically. And in fact, Casey dies, at 67. So, this is the type of thing. However, you can imagine the incredible karma that he amasses on the positive side by doing this and helping all these people and doing, 10 readings a day. The same thing could be said of Steiner, which is, it seems like there's almost like a rushing in the final few years of his life to set everything right. As a matter of fact, he tries to reincorporate anthroposophy, which I find fascinating. And he tries to almost make it into something else because he's very concerned about where it's headed then. So when we look at it that way, these people were dynamic enough to know, okay, I'm going to take this sacrifice upon myself. And if you look in 1915 at the onset of World War I, Steiner says the time for kind of going along nicely, studying these spiritual things has passed. We have to realize now that with spiritual science, there are forces that are kind of arrayed against us. And so we're going to be playing defense. This is kind of an important thing, I think, in the period that we're in, to have a similar kind of mindset. And I know people are already kind of, wound up as it is, but having some kind of extra insight around the idea that the forces that are arrayed against humanity at this period are really tuned up on a very high level. They're kind of going for broke. And so I kind of feel a little echo in Steiner's statement about, the time of just kind of going along with this. We have to be moving along with the teaching, yes, but we have to be aware that on the playing field, there are forces that are arrayed against us because of the direction we're going in. That's a good point. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series. This is X series 169, the 8th Sphere AI warning, Kona Blue UFO file. Very strange that all this is coming out. And the UFO file plays right into the heart of all this. We're taking your questions, and Miss Olivia is putting those together right now. We'll take a few more. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, David Tormina, isn't it the mystery schools themselves who are leading humanity towards the 8th sphere? Happy Hermit 3D responded, the left-hand path mystery schools are leading us to the 8th sphere, is the idea, if I understand correctly. What do you say?
No, yeah, the mystery schools are not leading us to the 8th sphere. Obviously, by putting the information out, they're trying to give us a direction to go around this Ahrimanic magnetization into this lifeless virtual reality 8th sphere. So the mystery schools in general are there to move the culture forward in a positive fashion. The problem is that there are schools that possess the same type of information that, the Great White Brotherhood does, who aren't working for those purposes. So you have this kind of secret society aspect operational in the heart of all this mystery knowledge. And what happens is those groups eye each other warily because they sit on the same levels of knowledge, but one is coming from a higher ideal. The other's coming from a more selfish ideal. And what's interesting, though, is it's not so black and white. As a matter of fact, Steiner sometimes talked about the extreme left. And what's interesting is I noticed that Steiner and Harrison both take left hand out, and they just use the term left. And they like the political
implications.
How it's used that way. And what's interesting is when Steiner talks about the war of all against all and how this is, part of what the Ahrimanic march is all about, he talks about the final breakdown in society being the right side of the body at war with the left side of the body. And if you get to a certain place with certain types of hormone manipulation and, gender manipulation and other things, I'm not talking about, casual things. I'm talking about the types of extremes that we've been seeing. Then you can very easily see how they could turn one side of the body against the other side of the body. And isn't that something to consider? Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay. Caritas Tarot, DJ, will we ever see Ahriman and the eighth sphere, or will it be more of an inner feely thing? How will we experience it?
No question that in Steiner's work, Ahriman has an incarnation in this century. It sounds like the beginning of this century to me. It looks like we're kind of prime time somewhere between now and 2040 of an incarnation. And it's interesting because he actually talks about a physical incarnation of it. And yet, knowing the type of being that we're talking about, it seems to me that Ahriman would incarnate as some kind of a cyborg, something that was a hybrid, like the Atlantean hybrid between a human and, a cyborg. This mix that they've been working on, they're hoping will give them a kind of immortality in a body. And they don't hide that at all. I think some of those real hyped up, the Ray Kurzweil types, this is their goal, and they don't want anyone to stop them. So I do feel that one of the things that we're seeing, and it was interesting that Henry Kissinger passed away last year because
sorry,
but I mean,
chill down my spine.
The idea is just fundamentally, somebody like that would be into this life extension technology. How do these people like Bushes and Kissingers and the Schwabs and all the rest of it, if they start living to 150 years old, it's going to become pretty obvious. So now they're all going to have to fake their deaths. So this could be part of the rush that they have on this. And this could be why the timeline's moved up, which is they have the key to doing that. And they want, themselves and their elite offspring to live these, 150, 200-year lives while saying to, Mr. Everyman, oh, your carbon footprint is bad for the planet. Yes.
Cameron says Ahriman is AI.
Yeah, I mean, there's an aspect of it that operates as artificial intelligence. I think you have to define some things about making technology conscious. And I'll go back to the Terminator movie because one of the things they do in that is they say, the defense computers, they say it got smart, suddenly it becomes self-aware. The harmonic force should be thought of as a dark astral force attached to Earth's evolution, and it got in and attached itself at a certain point. Nonetheless, even as bizarre as a situation as that is, the challenge of facing off against Ahriman can actually help humanity and set us up for a greater triumph of doing this. And it's interesting because Steiner has pointed out on a number of occasions where interfacing with Luciferic beings, facing the challenge of them and them trying to spirit, the souls of humanity off the planet. But our interaction with them, he says over and over again, has been beneficial. So you see how this works. It's all in how you deal with it, and it's interesting because in Steiner's case with Ahriman, he doesn't say let's flee from Ahriman. He says that humanity must not be taken unawares into this drowsy state, which can be, pulled into a virtual reality, and you find yourself part of this disappearing act in the eighth sphere, as it were. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Song of Prayer. They are building an etheric sphere to draw the souls of humanity. And Alchemical Wedding says, so it is meant to kind of separate your inner vision from the spiritual and lock it in the realm of Maya.
Oh, that's a good point also, which is it's meant to grab you at a point where you're evolving. Because, if somebody is living a life which doesn't have any consciousness, and, we can all think of somebody it's like this, where they're living on kind of a low materialistic level of consciousness. And they're not interested in spiritual ideas, and they're not interested in, humanity's evolution or anything like that. They're just locked into their next real estate deal, or being on Wall Street, or being a celebrity, whatever it happens to be. So there's a huge mix of people. When people start to become aware of inner aspects and inner abilities, then that's a little bit different, because somebody who's completely unconscious to that stuff is very easily manipulated. But when somebody becomes aware and open to spiritual ideas, they also enter a realm of manipulation. And because they're almost a threat to this thing that is holding humanity in place. And there's no question in my mind that small groups working together, which is what the mystery schools over and over again. I remember the Gurdjieff groups. One of the things that he recommended, for whatever it was worth, was that the groups that were put together were no more than 100 people at a time. That's interesting to me, because it seems like they form their own magnetic network. And if it's very potent, then it becomes, in the middle of all this, kind of like the Amish versus the overly urbanized, technologized populace. So you can see definite differences there. But to me, as you open up to your spiritual vision, you are facing off against something that is trying to prevent you from doing that. And yet it's the natural course of action. So it's the natural impulse towards spiritual evolution. And it's funny, I'll go back to the Gurdjieff thing again for a second, which is Gurdjieff said, a lot of his students would ask him, well, isn't humanity evolving anyway? And he said there's a very slow evolutionary pattern that goes on with humanity. And the thing is that the whole thing around mystery school work and the things that they preserved was basically to move that process into the right kind of speed. Because if it's just the evolutionary track of the earth, it's going to take a very long time indeed. Yes.
I'm gonna cut to the chase, which I like to do. Okay, so and there's lots of other great questions about sort of the dark side, right? The Ahriman and the eighth sphere, but the real knowing about them at a certain point isn't as important. Like, at what point do we switch to what do I need to do to avoid the eighth sphere and to just grow my spirituality? I mean, it's all the same thing, right? So, Alchemical Wedding said the ninth and final point was spiritual control, but I don't think that's possible as God is all powerful. And Esther Taylor said, know thyself. Isn't the whole point to embody your higher self? to be compassionate, to be empathetic, to be a loving, regardless of all this, just to be the most loving, generous version of yourself on no matter where you find yourself.
Oh yeah, yeah. Reminds me of a Casey quote, which is, the track that you're on, it's to make you basically a better person, a better neighbor, a better employee, a better boss, um, and to just make you a better person. And if it's not doing that, then leave it behind. The thing is, there's so many interpretations around things like religious philosophy, um, and then if you go deep into kind of hermetic wisdom and you get outsides of the systems of some of the real religious control, and then you realize some of those religious controls, when you pull them away from a society, the society doesn't do so well. So there's a lot of considerations. Somebody could look back, say, on Moses, and I have an interesting episode on Moses coming up from an esoteric point of view. But someone could look at that and say, well, he's kind of ruling with an iron fist because these people are in the desert for 40 years, and they, it seems like, at the slightest provocation, turn against all their spiritual training and start living it up in the desert and becoming savage like and stuff. So the question over and over again when you look at these different things is, what is ideal for humanity? And the thing is, it's such a broad track that I think working in groups, just like the Essenes bring forward the whole Christian wave, but the Essenes come out of um, the Elijah School of the Prophets and that whole lineage. So it is by concentrated effort, by a concentrated group, but it always starts with an individual. This is what I like about the concept around magnetic center, because there's only so far you can get with you in a book. True. And yet what happens is when you interact with that information, you're formulating a magnetic center towards different kinds of higher esoteric information, higher ideals. And so you're kind of attracting, your magnetic center attracts more of that, one, but two, it formulates a core. So you're never, it's never a waste to read a powerful book that makes a huge impression on you, because it's building that magnetic center. At the same time, I would also say that maybe, if it's just an isolated thing and somebody in an ivory tower running through spiritual ideas, that you're missing what it's all about, because the whole idea is for the interaction to produce a third thing. So what is great about the Gurdjieff work is there's yes, no, affirming, denying, and then there's the third aspect. And that third aspect is crucial, and you only get that through the interaction of your advanced self with the conditions of the world. Yes.
Could you explain magnetic center a little bit more? What it is, why it's important?
Yeah, I mean, I gave kind of an idea of it just there, but basically it shows up in the Gurdjieff work. And Gurdjieff always emphasizes that in mystery school work, you need to work with other people. The Casey work emphasizes cooperation. We talked about this in the last episode. So your magnetic center is something that's developed largely on your own. So it gives you the ability to develop these different latent aspects. So it has a value of kind of creating your trajectory. So therefore, there are times when you're going to have to work on your own. And I think what's interesting is I think about creative people that I know, or musicians and things like that. they need to take a certain amount of time on a solo basis to develop the idea, and then when they work with the group, it's a whole thing that happens. All these kind of wild things happen around their core idea. That's what it reminds me of. And I do think magnetic center is something you can always think of as when you are watching movies, um, reading books, studying ideas around those types of things. You're building that magnetic center at all times. Yeah.
What does the frequency of the Earth says magnetic center is flow state. I kept thinking about how it relates to when you're talking about musicians sort of paying your dues, or do you need to pay off karma so that you can be in a state of grace? How does this fit in?
Well, we did the karma piece last week, and I think it is crucial. I see it falling out of a lot of these conversations. Just like I see reincarnation not being understood front and center when you get around things to deal with the mystery side of things. Not that somebody has to accept reincarnation in order to study along this track. It's just interesting because in all the mystery traditions, reincarnation is sitting right there. And it's not, I hear it interpreted as this idea of the recycling of souls and things like that. It has nothing to do with that. And, this whole idea that, oh, well, if Christ reincarnated as other people, it means he wasn't so special or something. No, it's absurd. The whole idea would be to develop yourself to a certain state to be kind of the ultimate expression of you. And, when you look at the work around Edgar Cayce in particular, there's the greatest emphasis around reincarnation. The least emphasis around reincarnations in the Gurdjieff work. And part of that is they think, well, if you think you have a bunch of lives coming up in order to work all this stuff out, you'll procrastinate and you won't do it this time around. So they de-emphasize it. So again, it depends on where you're coming in from. But I would say certainly conceptually, karma is very important. The law of grace is very important. We used some examples last week of people like Nero coming back. And but the law of grace is interesting because apparently by activating the law of grace, you cut off the law of karma. And that's interesting. We also got into the idea that, very often reincarnation is thought of as a chain that keeps you bound to the earth and you have to escape it. Well, there's a number of things in the Cayce work that talks about these people having developed themselves, like the Saint Germain types, having developed themselves in this system to a point of perfection, but hanging around in order to help those that are still growing. So that, that gets into all kinds of ways of thinking about this. But certainly that's a much better way of thinking about it than being trapped in a cycle. I mean, you can see that could happen if people, you can see that in one life, if somebody, certainly around addiction issues, if somebody gets caught on a wheel and you reenact the same pattern over and over again, we hear about people doing this often. Yes.
Okay, Jen Passavant said, it sounds like our magnetic center is our heart, and when it's uplifted, opened, and expanded. This clicked in with me about that dream that I had where I died. When I realized I had died, I turned to the angels and I said, what do I need to become psychic in my next life? And they said, discipline and attunement. And I think that is what you were describing, is that's what discipline and attunement give you, is they build your magnetic center.
Yeah, it's interesting. Of course, I mean, there's the Cayce attunement and service. And he talks about how attunement can be like a volcano that overflows, and that if it's not tied in with some nature of service, then it becomes almost a burden. So this is interesting because a lot of people would take attunement on its own, and you see when you get around, I've met all kinds of different people and who are involved in like different types of spiritual practices and things. They can get very obsessed at times with getting into this attunement thing, and it doesn't seem like it's always the case that somebody is attuning themselves to be a better person for the rest of the world. They just want that ultimate attunement to be the best, kind of astral projector or magician or whatever it happens to be. So, there are all these things there. And I think people demonstrate amazing qualities and disciplines regardless sometimes of their goals, but certainly their intention, I think, is important. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 169, the 8th Sphere AI Warning, Kona Blue UFO file. Fascinating things happening as we're going through this. We're going to take a couple more of your questions, and then we're going to wrap it up tonight. Miss Olivia, you're up again.
Okay, Don Neway. The eighth sphere karma may only be the karma of our particular universe trajectory. In parallel universes, it may have been defeated.
Well, that's interesting. Right now, the way that it's spoken about, it's something that we have to deal with. So it's interesting to conjecture about different timelines for things. What if Hitler had taken over the world? It's possible, but what we appear to have on the ground with this is the kind of momentum that the eighth sphere has in a technological age. And this mineral component that we started the show with and that we demonstrated in the Terminator movie, I think is important because I think they're giving us a clue in the mystery information about mineralization. And I think that this whole thing about becoming immortal, having a silicon chip run your brain and all these types of things is all about this shortcut mineralization. So the super technocrat, the super AI person, the virtual reality program, the biometric identity aspect that is such an obsession of the Davos billionaire crowd. This all has to do with them thinking in the tree of life aspect, that the version of the tree of life where you go directly to the mineral level and you dismiss the animal level is a way to climb up some other way, as it were, and that you don't need to do the spiritual development of the seven centers in order to arrive at New Jerusalem, as they say in Revelation. Now, remember, New Jerusalem in the Steiner work is New Jupiter. And the thing that gets thrown off in the developmental stage is directly this whole piece about New Jupiter, because there's something that happens when the eighth sphere embodies so much of humanity and humanity is sort of tricked into the eighth sphere, that's the natural course of things. And we miss out on the genuine evolutionary track through what Steiner refers to as Vulcan again, which is a sphere that isn't visible. And that New Jupiter never gets born properly. That's New Jerusalem. That is the whole vision of Revelation, etc. So these things have an esoteric overlap. And the dogmatic religious practice, which has kept, a kind of perpetual peace going and kept a religion going, it was necessary. But it also, at a certain point, a real heavy religious dogma can be an Ahrimanic deterrent, believe it or not, to a true spiritual evolution, a kind of esoteric Christianity. This is interesting because you see sometimes that people get caught up in certain types of religious practice, and they, it becomes like the Bible thumper thing, and that's not genuine spiritual development. That has an Ahrimanic quality, in fact, to it. So we have to, kind of weigh that out too. I mean, Christians are very often targets as well. And this is interesting to me because that super materialistic society can really target Christians. So the scientific materialism wanted to cut everyone off from their spirituality. That's pure Ahrimanic development. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, this is a really pivotal question. So Hermit Dad says, how would you recommend we fight Ahriman in the here and now? I want to add my 2 cents that I think a lot of people get stuck in the intellectual, and that's why they can't answer the question, is they're asking with their mind, right? The key is always the same, is you have to go within, you have to consult your higher self, your guides, your angels. Like you have to pray, you have to be on your knees with God. And if you are in attunement or alignment, the answers come, and it's individual. It's not necessarily collective. All of us together, we don't all have the same jobs here, but we can ask what our job is individually, our role, what we can do today, and generally in the phase of life that we're in. We don't want it. Well, one size fits all doesn't work.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
the whole point, if Ahriman wants to take us away from God, right, is that we consult God, go back, connect, reconnect, and keep connecting to God.
Well, that's interesting. You have Mephistopheles in Faust is Ahriman. And it's very interesting to see that interplay, because I think there are hints in the Faust story about how to play off against that kind of a force that wants to basically keep you in a backward cycle on this evolutionary track. And remember, we think about freedom and slavery and all the rest of it. Those words come up in all the public mystery school traditions. And specifically, when the eighth sphere is mentioned, there's a whole thing about Ahrimanic slavery. So I think it's pretty easy for us to understand that. People with addictions, certainly, but this society encourages certain types of addictions. The technology itself, video games, pornography, um, drugs, the emphasis around that, you can see it. That's a very obvious connection for us to see. And we see, people, so many people wrapped up in that. So I think what we're talking about is the understanding and seeing the kind of subtle doorways that Ahrimanic presence has, and the idea more and more of the society in general becoming more and more intolerant of your natural spiritual inclination. That's something to watch. And you see it in schools, you see it in the medical profession. It's on the march. And this is exactly, when people are talking about, hey, things are so upside down in the world right now. We just went through the COVID op. We've got the CIA building up a UFO threat op. And we have this, political system trying to create civil war. I mean, you can see the clash of these forces, the exact things that were being warned about in these earlier periods through the mystery traditions. The last question of the night, Miss Olivia.
Hold on. I'm going to combine these three because I like the way they're connecting.
Excellent. I want to mention this too, which is I'm going to address something at the very end of the show about the tradition of an advanced astral etheric body kept in the mystery tradition. This is going to be interesting and set up an upcoming episode. Europe.
Okay, so Reese Peacock said, we don't fight Ahriman, we walk away and develop ourselves. Wayne Peak says, get back. And Jessica Rodriguez
Get back,
says,
JoJo.
Yeah, I love it. Jessica Rodriguez says, I think the secret is to retuning our bodies and minds are in the ancient temples that are all around the world. They have powerful frequency and vibration acoustics with sounds that can unlock us.
Oh, that's really, really true. There's a whole different aspect to awaken those spiritual qualities, and it has nothing to do with our intellectual pursuits. That's the interesting thing there. It bypasses that, as do dreams, symbolism. That's why things like tarot are so important, I think, because they the symbolism bypasses directly that kind of intellectual grid and goes straight to the higher emotional center. How does that image make you feel? And I think things like the Giza Plateau and other types of structures have that impact because those who put them together understood, they're putting in a kind of a spiritual blueprint there. I'm going to read this real briefly, and it'll give us some idea because Atlantis ties into a lot of this, and we're going to wrap this episode up with this. It comes directly out of Steiner's Outline of Occult Science. Toward the end of the Atlantean period of evolution, a great evil gradually began to manifest itself within mankind. The mystery of the initiates ought to have been carefully guarded from individuals who had not purified their astral bodies of error through preparation. When such human beings acquire a certain insight into mystery knowledge, into the laws by which higher beings guide the forces of nature, they then place these laws at the service of their perverted needs and passions. The danger was all the greater since human beings, as already described, came into the realm of lower spiritual beings who, unable to carry out the regular earth evolution, acted contrary to it. These spiritual beings influenced human beings constantly by arousing in them interests that were, in truth, directed against the welfare of humanity. But human beings still had the ability to use the forces of growth and reproduction of animal and human nature for their own purposes. Not only ordinary human beings, but also a number of initiates gave in to the temptation of lower spiritual beings. They went so far as to use the described supersensible forces in a way that ran counter to the development of mankind. For this activity, they sought associates who were not initiated and who, for lower ends, seized upon the mysteries of the supersensible workings of nature. That piece, for me, grabs the essence of the nature of the situations we can see, how these people can have higher knowledge, but also be operating on this very low level and pulling down others who are operating on this initiatory place. Now, I think it happens in a much more subtle fashion now, but a lot of people ask me, well, how can people who have this like high knowledge kind of go into dark occult and try to use it for those purposes? It looks like this battle has been going on for a long, long time. It took place back there in Atlantis, and the problem was the lack of preparation against these forces coming in. And there's a whole piece in there about what they needed to do is they perfected these 7 astral bodies of these initiates, and then they would reuse them so the people who were being born into these new lives would be set up kind of like the Dalai Lama, and they would be being given these advanced astral and etheric bodies and continue on the life of this initiate. So it's
Wait a second. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah,
That's really interesting.
It's pretty interesting. I noticed that Zoroaster shows up in 7,500 BC in the Casey readings, but also in 500 BC. So there's some process that keeps the consciousness going of a figure like Zoroaster. Now, when we go further and we think about other characters like Rata and all the rest of it, this whole thing about Egyptian, the abilities that they had to mummify, and how those organs are basically still good today when we open up their crypts. There's something kind of fascinating about this, and the idea that these Atlanteans in that period could use the astral kind of outfit as a library resource for an incoming soul incarnation. and that's how they kept this lineage going of these initiates. We're going to follow up on that theme coming up in an episode dealing with initiatory practices, but I think it's something worth kind of giving you a zinger there at the end with the work of Rudolf Steiner. And I will say that, in my opinion, Steiner, although he was not the first person to speak out about the eighth sphere, gave us the most complete version of exactly what we were dealing with, again, in very guarded language, however. So I still feel that on this subject, we understand a very small fragment of it. And so it should be opened up on a deeper and deeper level. Certainly the relationship with AI and the beings operating in this kind of lifeless state in the eighth sphere has a huge crossover with that Ahrimanic teaching. And with that, Miss Olivia?
I am going to ask this one last question because I really think it's a great question.
Right.
So Diane Chadwick said, please ask if the abductions between the 50s and the early 90s are directly related to this eighth sphere technology takeover in the new hybrid race being mysteriously placed on Earth. Where do these hybrids fit in? And colonization and the X-Files?
Yeah, that's interesting. I will say this, that I think that we're going to find in the midst of all this that aspects of the UFO file have a direct correlation and crossover with the eighth sphere piece. It's not in total. And the idea, very often you'll hear people say UFOs are demons, and, those operating them are fallen beings and all the rest of it. I think it can be true, but it's not. The idea of UFOs and aliens as demons doesn't wash because you could be dealing with a different developmental track. And I think the mystery schools themselves trying to say that the human evolutionary patterns had a certain track and have a certain track, and that the eighth sphere aspect is artificial. So you're dealing with something else, but there may be a lot of things operating in between, including civilizations that were able to shelter themselves, with their technology a long time ago, and have grown up kind of side by side with the humanity that we understand. Certainly the idea of off-world visitors, it became a heavy emphasis in all of this. I think it was overemphasized, but nonetheless, I don't discount it. So therefore, I think there's a lot of different things that are going on there. But the fact that you suggest this overlap between the eighth sphere and the UFO file is, I think, one of those fragments that is gigantic. And this is something I think that we can bring forward in the middle of all this, that part of this aspect that we're talking about, the whole thing about the UFO file is, if you go into the various abductions and you go into the human experience of it, you're going to get so much more information than you will from some counterintelligence agent telling you this is where they're keeping bodies. That's not where this is at all. Unfortunately, the whole counterintelligence thing is to feed you false truths about it. So we're never going to get the truth from the government about this. However, we can use aspects of the government to open the mystery up better. And I think that that's very worthwhile. The way to approach the UFO file piece, in my opinion, is the cases of APOTHEUM that have to do with the individual abduction experiences. Betty and Barney Hill case, tons of APOTHEUM. The car doesn't start. They float. Their time, all the missing time that they have, the timing disappears. The compass goes crazy on their car. There's so much APOTHEUM in that case that, this is what we're talking about, which is the interaction with this thing. It's through studying that interaction that you get to the bottom of it, instead of just superstitiously saying, well, that's a demon, or, going too far without enough information, really. So I think that is a very, the APOTHEUM piece and the UFO file piece, this is a very worthwhile area of study. And, unfortunately, the overemphasis, the jellyfish UFO, and the kind of junk that they put out from the CIA side, that's where the whole thing goes off track. The individual cases, the John Mack cases, Ray Fowler, the things that happen to these people and the interaction of their consciousness with this other thing, that's huge. And for me, that's the heart of the UFO file research. And with that, Miss Olivia, we are done for tonight. Super chatters away.
Give me 1 second. I'll line them up. Okay. So we've got Jonathan McIntosh, Brian Storm, Midlife Less Ordinary, Eurythmia's Fun, Happy Hermit 3D, Song of Prayer, Boba the Clown, Short Order Cook 1, Jennifer and Bucks, Les Scott, Judy Maurice, Nicole D, Jessica Rodriguez, Roosevelt Media News, Infinitum Neo, Norman Smith, Robert Scott, The Bikini Truther, Lindy T, C.A. Bever Forden, Debbie McAdoo, Wayne Peak, Terry Doherty, Sarah Jane, David John Moan, Jenny Runco, Tommy Van Gumpel, YouTuber 427. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. Wow. What a great ideas room. We really appreciate your support tonight. And of course, to all our subscribers, we couldn't do what we do without you. So all of your support makes it the huge difference to everything. We will be back with you next week. I want to emphasize we have this very important Atlantis special that we put all this incredible information and production into, coming up for you on May 3rd, which is 2 weeks from tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern time.
God, it's going to be May already?
It's a 2-hour special, and you don't want to miss it. But that's going to be something very much worthwhile. I'm going to do some shout outs here. I see Scarlet Fire out there, Esther Taylor. My mouse isn't working for some reason. Fascinating episode. Thank you. Luminous Lux. Can't wait for the next show. Jessica Rodriguez. It's great to have you out there, Jessica. Wow. Nicely done, Miss Olivia. Bravo. Bravissimo. Fantastic handling of those questions. Norman Smith, May 3rd. You've got the date. The Craze in the Hot Zone. This is Atlantis. Very special name to that too, but I'm not going to reveal the name of the full episode until next week because God knows what they would do with it as soon as I put it out. Great show again. Wow. Thank you, Blue Man 2012. Hey, Blue, you got the blue in your title right there. Caritas Tarot. Well done. Thank you. Active Faith. It's great to see you. Thomas Ball. Thank you, Daniel and Olivia Wingsgirl. Great show. Les Scott. Thank you, sir. Neo Lemuria. There's a great name. Roosevelt News. Thank you for another great show, DJ and Olivia. Roosevelt, it's great to see you out there. I know Kate's out there. I hope you're doing great. Scratch. Great stream, DJ and Olivia. There's Najat. Good night, dear Wings Girl. Scarlet Fire. The last day is good will be called evil, and evil will be called good. Yeah, it's a little bit of an upside down world, isn't it? I love that phrase when Jesus is talking to the disciples and they're like, we're getting hassled when we go into these towns, like preaching this stuff, and they're really freaked out. They thought this was going to be easy. And he said, look, the time is going to come when, people are going to want to kill you because of the things, your support of the things that I'm bringing forward. And they'll think as they're like chasing you out of town that they're doing God a service. So, this has been going on for a long time. Lindy T, far out. Indeed. Far out. I would agree. What else we got out there? What a great crew out there in the Ideas Room. Active Faith, Horse Lady, Golden Girl, CR User, Ivan Langley. I want to break free. I'm sure that's a Queen reference.
Yes.
There. Excellent. We will see you all next week, and we won't be in the 8th sphere, and neither will you, hopefully. But lots of incredible things coming up. I will go deeper into those 56 pages of the Kona Blue tonight. We touched on it a little bit tonight, but there's more to come there.
Can I add just one thing?
Yeah.
Okay. I had an incredible day today where God kept giving me opportunities to make the world smaller, more beautiful, more loving, more kind. It was incredible. Like the energy, that I like helping a woman walk who was having a hard time walking and talking to her and anyway, it was just, and it was so authentic and so organic and so fabulous. But the feeling that I got from being just in the moment and being really present with other human beings and not looking at my phone, but talking to the strangers, talking to them, looking in their eyes, smiling. Strangers were looking at me. I must have been emanating something incredible, some light. Like it was just fabulous. And if I could have every day be that, it's not about the big things.
It's amazing
with my life.
when
It's
it works.
just those interactions.
Yeah. Ready for World War III. Get it? It's the ultimate contrast.
This is it. What can you do? Make your little corner of the world better.
Yes.
You can do that. You get the power to do that today.
There's
this
no
weekend.
question. There's no question. It starts
because it makes you feel good too.
Yes, absolutely. It starts with you, and it says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
11:11. Jen Passivat. There you go. And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and we may be looking at some interesting things going on in the political realm here in 2024. So let's keep our eyes open on that one, and we'll see y'all next week.
God bless.
Have a great night, everyone. Not in the 8th sphere.
Thank God.